Thank you so much for this opportunity, and thanks everybody for joining us in this Monday afternoon. We're going to talk about the 5 deadly sins of SharePoint in the enterprise. It's my pleasure to be with you in the next hour. And for those that I haven't met, that I don't know, again, welcome. My name is Dux Raymond Tsai, and I've been working in this technology since the early 2000s. And one of the things I'm sure a lot of you, especially attending this webcast, have heard or have seen is how SharePoint is just growing and growing and growing. Just quick statistics, SharePoint is the most profitable product Microsoft ever had, and it's continuously growing. I think in the last 5 years, every day there's 20,000 new licenses of SharePoint that gets activated. So that just goes to show how predominant and how widely adopted this is in the enterprise. And just like any other technology or relatively new technology, although it's not quite new, it's 10 years old, there's a lot of things that's going on in the enterprise today that kind of spurred me to talk about this topic, and very excited also to share some of tips and tricks and recommendations on how you can either avoid or get past these sins if you're already encountering it. So let's get going here. So what are we going to look at specifically in this presentation? So in this presentation, literally, I'm going to share what these 5 deadly sins are, and I'll share the backstory of this, why I called it the 5 deadly sins. And we're going to look at key areas around why it's an issue or why it's a challenge when organizations treat governance as a one-time event. Now, some of you may have heard of this word around SharePoint governance and why it's very important. But one of the problems we see in the enterprises today, though they think that they've implemented SharePoint governance, it's really, no offense meant, but it's people just paying a lip service. Treating governance as a one-time thing, we've done it, check the box, doesn't work. So we'll talk about why it doesn't work and recommendation how to make that work. Second sin we're going to talk about is this idea of IT leadership, abdicating responsibility for information architecture and SharePoint road mapping. What we see a lot today is the decision makers who ask that SharePoint be put in the organization have no clue of what this technology is about and what this platform is about. And that's not being disrespectful, but it's just they're not aware on the power of this platform. So we're going to talk about how you address that and how you overcome that. We're also going to look at the sin of treating user adoption and training as an afterthought. I've worked with a lot of IT organizations, helping them, advising them roll out SharePoint. And in a typical IT fashion, okay, we've got the servers in place, we've rolled out the farms. Oh, okay, what about training? What about training, right? It's always an afterthought, and that doesn't quite work with SharePoint. So we'll talk about what's the best way to address that and what's a more proactive way and diligent way to address training and adoption. We'll talk about the sin of organizations underestimating human resource implications. And what I mean by this is it's so funny, like a typical organization, hey, you're the Windows admin, right? You're the sysadmin. Well, now not you as a SharePoint admin. On top of your day job, you're also the SharePoint guy or gal. And by the way, you're going to roll it out to the whole company, to 1,000 people, and we want it done in 2 months. That's a problem right there. And we're going to talk about what are the necessary skill set, what are the core skill sets on how you can be successful with your SharePoint implementation. And then last but not the least, we'll talk about the problem of failing to educate and engage executives. And this kind of ties back to the second point of IT leadership not being involved with information architecture roadmap. So very excited, and again, just a quick background of myself. I'm a managing partner with Innovative E. We're based out of Washington, D.C. and in Atlanta, Georgia. Our organization, we focus on helping companies maximize the business value of SharePoint. So we can certainly advise and help you from a technology standpoint, but I guess we're very passionate about is really maximizing the business value of SharePoint. I'm a SharePoint Server MVP, very privileged to have written the book SharePoint for Project Management, published by O'Reilly Media. And there's my contact info, so feel free to connect with me. Again, if you're tweeting, my Twitter handle is MeetDux, and tweet away with the hashtag 5DS. Okay? So let's go ahead and get started, and let me give you a quick backdrop of how all this 5 deadly sins came about, and then we'll talk about these 5 deadly sins. So as I've described and as I've mentioned, I've been in the business since the early 2000s. SharePoint formally is 10 years old. It's a 10-year-old product for those of you who don't know. But when SharePoint first came about, it wanted to solve the fundamental issue of collaboration. It sounds so simple, but it's a problem we deal with day in, day out. I mean, for example, very basic example. Do you guys know what the #1 collaboration tool in the enterprise today is? Now, some of you might answer, well, we're using very sophisticated tools, I guess, because we're in the 21st century. Everybody has an iPhone 4S. We have GPS in our car. We have, TiVo at home because we have to record Dancing with the Stars. So we must be so high-tech when we do collaboration in the enterprise. Not really. The #1 enterprise collaboration tool, you want to admit it or not, is email. A 1973 technology, email. There you go. And don't get me wrong, it works, but friends, it could be better. So SharePoint wants to address that fundamental question and fundamental challenge around collaboration. And collaboration is more than just sharing files or updating documents. We can also say collaboration revolves around reporting. Collaboration can revolve around compliance. Anytime two or more people work together for a specific reason, specific intent, that's collaboration right there, regardless of the media they're using. So SharePoint wants to address that, and SharePoint does address that, but the problem is when SharePoint is being rolled out in the organization today, this is what we see, right? So we help organizations roll out SharePoint. What we see a lot where organizations get in trouble is that far right. It's what I call the wild, wild west chaos. And what that means is, in a typical fashion, IT gets a hold of SharePoint. Let's play with this. Let's start a pilot. Let's play with SharePoint in the IT department. Let's see how we like it. And then suddenly somebody in IT says, hey, marketing, check this out. We got this cool new collaboration toy called SharePoint. You want to try it? So marketing tries it out. Sales tries it out. And then 2 weeks later, what a pilot program, pilot initiative, who supposedly is, suddenly blew up, became production. The whole company's using it. 2-3 weeks in, everybody loves it. It's better than email. On the 4th week, since there's no planning, no rhyme or reason, everybody started using it, it's a mess, right? You've got stuff all over the place. There's a lot of sites. People can't access what they're supposed to access to. Everybody hates the platform. Everybody hates the tool. Oh, SharePoint sucks. Well, keep in mind, it's a tool, right? If somebody tells you again that SharePoint sucks, look at them directly in the eyes and tell them SharePoint doesn't suck, you suck. But my point is, it's a tool. And that's what's happening in the enterprise today, where it's chaotic, right? And on the other end of the spectrum, there's the subset of organizations where SharePoint is being so tightly held, what I call, it's the draconian IT control implementation, where even if you just want to upload a document, you have to request IT permission to do that. So where you want to get to is this middle ground. This middle ground is what we call governed empowerment. And the idea is you want to put the platform in place with certain parameters so that the users, the business, people in the organization can maximize this platform for their collaboration needs. And to get to that middle ground, it's different for different organizations. So what's the deal with this 5 deadly sins, right? So starting in June, my organization, we work with another organization called the Eventful Group. We actually work with Fortune 500 customers because we're seeing these patterns of where enterprises are challenged with SharePoint. But we wanted to formalize it. So we work with the Eventful Group, and we actually held roundtable focus group sessions across the East Coast, 7 cities, and we talked about 300 people in the business. Not necessarily IT, but a lot of business folks, and really wanted to understand what their pain points are, what are the challenges are. And these are the list of things that came up. If you want to see the full list, there's the URL there. Feel free to check it out. But we ranked them, and lo and behold, the 5 deadly sins, which we already knew, that's predominant, prevalent in the organization really surface are some of the top 5 challenges. So let me talk about these 5 deadly sins and step through each sin. And guys, if you have questions, feel free to drop your comments, questions in the chat room. And then as we go through this, I'll also show you some examples, and I'll also show you some, more importantly, some artifacts that may help you so that you won't be you won't fall into these traps or these sins in your organization. So what's the first sin? So based on this research, informal research and also this formal focus group, the number one sin or the number one challenge that organizations, the enterprise face when SharePoint is deployed is this idea of governance happening as a one-time event. Okay? So let me expound on that. One of the things I find, and then personally I find it humorous, when people hear the word governance, they think of control. They think of people choking, IT not being, not giving us democratic environment so that we can successfully collaborate. Well, governance is really not control. Governance is just putting boundaries so things would work out according to how the organization works. So, for example, like I live in the United States, a democratic society. I enjoy my freedom. However, the United States is governed by certain rules and laws, right? Way back when, our forefathers, they had to come up with, the Constitution. Think about the Constitution as the governance of this country, and they spent time and effort and understood what this country is about and shaped that governance around the United States. Now, simply put, what's going on in the SharePoint world today, especially if you ask IT, the way people look at SharePoint governance is it's just a mere document. When I work with some customers, I ask them, so what does your SharePoint governance look like? Oh yeah, I went to MSDN, I downloaded that governance template from Microsoft, and we filled in the blanks, we emailed it to around the department, had people sign it, and boom, we had governance. Ain't gonna work, buddy. I mean, imagine if our forefathers decided to go to constitution.com and downloaded a Constitution template, emailed it around, and decided, yes, we've got Constitution for the U.S. It's not going to work. Governance is more than just a document. It's a living, breathing entity that encompasses IT but involves the business as well. So one of the things that you have to think about with governance is looking at not only the tool itself, collaboration capabilities and their benefits, but you also have to think about organizational needs. Things like compliance, things like realistically what's your budget, how much can you do and how much can you not do, right? And you have to ensure the plan evolves with the business. A governance strategy around SharePoint is not a one-time thing. It's not a single document. Again, comparing it to our laws and guidance that we have in our society, new laws comes up, new laws gets updated. So governance is a living, breathing thing. You have to also consider who creates a plan, who owns it, who enforces it. It's not a matter of creating a governance document and emailing to everybody and say, okay, here's our SharePoint governance, have fun. It's just going to work. The key is you have to define roles and responsibilities, meaning, okay, for example, part of our governance, we would have a SharePoint steering committee that includes IT, includes certain people in the business, and certain people have this responsibilities. So there's that level. And then there might be a level around the actual users, right? So part of our SharePoint governance, every site manager would be responsible for maintaining site content, would be responsible for managing site permissions, and they'll be measured against that. And then there's also a fine line between enforcement and empowerment. So there are certain rules that just has to happen, especially if you're in a highly compliant environment, right? But there are certain things that, depending on what the group is, depending on what they're doing, for example, like marketing, they tend to do a lot more creative type of things where they need to they need to share multiple types of media. It could be videos, it could be audio. So around that lines, rules for that might be different than more, like the legal department, where they work strictly with documents, highly compliant. So the point is, there's a governance template out there. You can use that as a basis, but you have to tweak it and change it and update it according to your business. There's a sample governance plan that you see in that link. You can download that, and that's something I created and I've used for my organization. I've kind of sanitized it. But when you look at that, it's a good combination of technical governance and also business governance. And it also has guidance on roles and responsibilities. And more importantly, it's not treated as a one-time event. So avoid the sin of thinking about governance or setting up a governance strategy is something that you only do when you implement SharePoint, when you upgrade SharePoint. But governance is an ongoing activity and sub-activities around it too, which involves a handful of people that have different responsibilities. Next, what's the second sin? The second deadly sin with SharePoint is leadership not involved in drawing up information architecture. Okay? So one of the problems with SharePoint, based on this research we've done, is we found the inability to find information quickly and easily is one of the biggest frustrations with the users. Now, again, depending on the organization type you are, depending on the size and the scales, it's very, very important to involve decision makers on information architecture design. So for example, let me just give you a quick example. So we know in a typical organization there's different departments, different functions, but depending on the type of information you interact with, how you design your information architecture varies. So let's say an HR document, or an HR policy document, I should say, is something that everybody should be able to access, right? Because I need to see my benefits, all the holidays and whatnot. However, only people in HR or certain people in HR can update the HR policy. So how do you design an information architecture around your SharePoint implementation so that only people in HR, certain people in HR can update it, but everybody else in the company can see it? But then there's this other aspect of information around organization, like when you work on projects, for example. When you work on projects, right, the nature of projects, it has a beginning, it has an end. So the question becomes, once the project is ended, what happens to all the artifacts? Do you just delete it? Do you archive it because you have to comply with certain standards such as Sarbanes-Oxley? Who can touch it? Who can't touch it after the project? So these are some of the decision points that key business leaders has to be involved with. IT can only do so much in terms of defining the IA, because at the end of the day, the business know their business better than anybody else. Right? Next is, will out-of-the-box provide sufficient search capabilities, or is custom solutions necessary? So SharePoint out-of-the-box comes with a very good search engine, but there are certain types of organization that is content-heavy, artifact-heavy, that you might want to invest in a more powerful search engine, like fast search, for example. So the key takeaway here is information architecture design is not limited to the IT group responsibilities. Key people in the business should be involved, right? Let me share my screen because I want to show you a couple other things. So I'm going to share you a screen. I'm going to show you, let me hit screen share. I'm going to show you some pictures, but I just want to give you an idea of what IA design looks like. Okay, so Yasmina, let me know if you see my screen.
It's just coming on now.
Okay. So what I'm showing you, gang, is, yeah, Kyle, absolutely. You nailed it right there. Again, at the end of the day, SharePoint is a tool, right? So, Yasmina, are you seeing it? Just to make sure.
We're seeing it.
Okay, good. So what I'm showing everyone is this is a quick example of IA activity I help a customer with. But literally, so just an example. So what we did is this organization, very network share intensive, so they want to grow out of that. They want to use SharePoint for their intranet. So we did a very, it's not intensive, but it took 2-3 days. So I had them do a couple of things. Right? We inventory the kind of information they work with on a daily basis. I asked the question, if you bucketed these information, are they formal, like an HR policy? Are they project-based, or are they ad hoc? What's the longevity of these information? Are they intended to be around forever? Are they intended only for that project or intended only for this fiscal year? So those kinds of things. And then we also went through the exercise of figuring out who can touch it, right? So we talked about that. And then we also, based on that exercise, looked at, okay, how are we going to design information flow, right? So let's say the HR policy document is owned by the HR group, which will sit in the HR site, but everybody needs to see it. Does that mean we should let everybody come in the HR site? Absolutely not. So the idea is on the homepage of the company portal, which pretty much would keep all the referential data, we can make it a way that the HR policy document, once updated, would surface up for everybody, not a separate copy, would surface up because everybody needs to see it. So long and short of it, what I'm trying to say is these are the kinds of exercises that needs to happen. And again, you have to involve key business people who knows their business, okay? Now, that's a quick example I want to stress on. I mean, there's a lot of great guidance out there. There's a lot of great resources around IA. There's a link I gave you, but a couple of people you might want to look at is Reuben Gotts. He uses mind mapping technique in being able to design information architecture. All right. So leadership, business leaders being involved in IA, very, very important. Number 3, the third deadly sin. Okay, third deadly sin around SharePoint in the enterprise. Training and adoption as an afterthought. Okay, so it's common to see IT take a technology-first approach and roll out SharePoint with little consideration for the user impact. So one of the things with SharePoint, if you haven't figured out already, it's a big paradigm shift. SharePoint in itself can empower people, but there's a but the way you do things in SharePoint is totally different than what people are used to. So getting them involved up front, understanding what their needs are prior to doing anything with the platform is very, very critical. So you need to engage the business early on. Identify and prioritize business solutions for them. And remember, always think about with them user mindset. What I mean by with them is what's in it for the user? What's in it for me? Okay. So what's a relevant training approach for them? I can see if you're with IT, yeah, you got to learn the nuts and bolts of what SharePoint is. But if you're in the business, there's no point in training the business how to click on certain things. I mean, there is, don't get me wrong, but the bigger value of how you train users is really around how you address their pain points. What's in it for them? Okay, what's in it for them? So how do you go about by doing this, Dux? Well, a couple of things. Mark, did I see a Mac Safari screen? Yes, I'm using a Mac. This is kind of aside. Are there any limitations? Not much, but I could talk more about that in a while. So how do you approach training, right? So let me share, these are some resources, but let me share what I do and what I found effective, okay? So anytime when we work with customers, when we help roll out SharePoint or we help upgrade SharePoint, whatever, I always make sure 2 things happen. Number 1 is I spend time with the executives because I want to educate the executives about SharePoint and the power of SharePoint to their organization. I'll talk more about that later in sin number 5. But number 2 is I spend time with the business and I engage them in what's called an engineering session, okay, an engineering session. So what's an engineering session? The idea of engineering is to educate the business about the platform, about SharePoint, and help them engineer a solution with it. Because again, SharePoint is a platform. It's like a clay. You can build solutions on top of it. That's why when you ask 10 people what SharePoint is, you get 10,000 answers. All of them are correct, right? So that's my intent, is to engineer solutions with the business. So literally, I'd be in a room with the head of HR, the head of operations, the head of finance, and we'd spend 2 hours to 4 hours depending on how big the implementation is. And most of them, by the way, have some exposure to SharePoint. And unfortunately, the kind of exposure to SharePoint that they've gotten is they think of SharePoint as nothing but a glorified network share. Unfortunately, 80% of SharePoint deployments out there are nothing but a glorified network share. It's a file dumping ground. It's much more than that. So I get in a room with these business decision makers, and literally I ask, a simple question. What's your pain point in your line of business? And obviously I get a stare look. What are you talking about? It's pain point, right? So I pick on HR, because HR is familiar to everyone. I would say, hey, HR director, do you guys have an onboarding process? And obviously the person would say, yeah, of course. So he or she would go on explaining what their onboarding process is. And then I would ask, okay, sounds like you got an onboarding process, but does it ever occur a new employee comes into the organization and for some reason IT forgot to create a login or an office wasn't provisioned, a phone wasn't provisioned, that new employee would be hanging out the hallway for a week? Yeah, that happens. Okay, so something's not right here, HR. You've got a process on onboarding new employees, but then the new employee's hanging out the hallway. What's wrong with that? Where's the disconnect? Then HR would go, well, our process is so manual. And the problem is we do everything via email. When a manager wants a new employee, the manager has to go to the network share, 18 folders deep, fill out that new employee request form, email it to HR. HR does the hiring. When HR finishes with the hiring, we contact IT to create accounts. But if IT drops the ball, that new employee might be hanging out the hallway. How much does that cost, HR? Yeah, it costs money because that person's not doing anything. So I go, why don't you automate all that? We've been telling IT to do it for us, but IT's always busy, this, that, the other, yada, yada, yada. I go, no, HR. Why don't you automate it? How can we? We're not programmers. We can't build systems. We can't build automated onboarding systems. I go, what if you can? Check this out. So right then and there, I fire up on my screen, out-of-the-box SharePoint environment. I create a new employee request form, right? I could use InfoPath. I could create a custom list. I slap in some automated workflows that comes out of the box with SharePoint. And mind you, all this, no programming, it's all out of the box. In 15, 20 minutes, I have a prototype of an automated onboarding system completed. Literally, when a manager request for a new employee, an alert would go out to HR, and if HR doesn't do anything, a constant alert would go out to HR. Once HR has done their part, it will contact IT. If IT doesn't do their part, it will remind IT, and it has a running audit of all these activities, all automated. And once they see that, they go, wow, now SharePoint is in a whole different light. SharePoint is more than just a network share. Why I'm describing all this is you got to engage the business up front to make them realize SharePoint is a business enablement platform. And then what you're building is you're building business solutions. In this case, we're building an onboarding system. Or you might be building a project management system. You might be using SharePoint for a conference room scheduling system. I don't know. But the point is, what's in it for them, right? You don't want to start training your users and say, well, here's SharePoint, go and prosper. It's like saying, hey, 4-year-old kid, here's a toolbox, go find a problem. Ain't going to work. Here are some training and adoption resources. Feel free to check them out. But again, training users around SharePoint has to be around their world. Has to be around their world. And you can't take the fast food approach, which I've seen a lot in organizations. How do you like your SharePoint? You want sites, you want surveys, you want wikis, you want to supersize it? How about BCS? Next, that fast food approach ain't going to work. Fourth deadly sin, okay? Fourth deadly sin. Organizations underestimate human resources requirement for SharePoint. You see, what's funny is management overlooks how broad SharePoint is and relies on existing personnel with little expertise to deliver the platform and business solution. So here's the irony, right? SharePoint as a platform can do a lot of different things. I mean, some say it could do content management, reporting, business intelligence, and really the value proposition of SharePoint is why it's growing ever increasingly is organizations today have various tools that they rely on for content management, for reporting. And with SharePoint as a single platform, in theory, right, they can, in lieu of these separate tools, they can rely on this single platform to help them. Now, the irony of all this is traditionally, if you get a content management tool, a reporting tool, a document management tool, you would hire different people with specific skill sets for that specific tool and that specific capability. But not with SharePoint, because organizations think all we need is our Windows admin, right? And on top of their day job, they could do SharePoint, and they could deliver all these solutions that the business needs. Not. Various skill sets are needed. And when I say various skill set, it's not just a developer or a Windows admin or a sysadmin. You see that picture with the Superman thing. I was in a conference, and I was all dressed up, I was all suited up, and I was talking about appropriate resources for your SharePoint environment. And so as I was describing this, I took my coat off, I took my tie off, and I said, look guys, I got to fess up. My name is not Dux, my name is Dux L. My father is Jor-El, my grandfather is Kal-El. Superman, right? I come from a long line of superheroes, but I'm ashamed to admit it because I thought I could do this whole SharePoint thing by myself, but I failed miserably. But that's a true picture of what SharePoint looks like today, right? Where there's limited resources. It's such a powerful platform where we have limited resources to maximize it, and second, we don't have the right resources to maximize it. That last point, having a SharePoint business analyst is key. I mean, if you look for a job today, there's a lot of jobs for SharePoint. Companies are looking either only for two things. We need a SharePoint admin and SharePoint developer. Well, newsflash, yeah, need those two. However, most likely, you don't need those two right away. Once SharePoint is in place, or even you use a hosted solution, the key resource you will need is what I call a SharePoint business analyst. And what a business analyst does is really allowing the conversation to happen between the business and translating it to IT. Yeah. So let me show you an example. I'm going to share my screen again, and I'm going to show you a typical exercise a business analyst would do if they want to help roll out SharePoint for the organization. Okay. So here's an example, right? Here's an example of a spreadsheet that I use. This is for a recent project. So we help an organization upgrade to SharePoint 2010. So one of the things the analyst did is, well, let me first define what this analyst role looks like. This analyst obviously would be well-versed in business analysis, requirements development, but also familiar with SharePoint. And when I say familiar, at least from out of the box, right? The SharePoint analyst doesn't necessarily have to be a programmer or a very hardcore IT person, but clearly this person has to know what SharePoint can do out of the box. So what this analyst did is, in this large organization, this person worked with the operations department, HR department, and finance department. And the intent here is to understand what their pain points are. Again, it's that whole education engineering solution. The business would know their pain point better than anybody else. So for example, operations said, well, Dux, we're challenged with SOP creation. The way we're doing it now is so manual, rely on email, emailing files. We would like to automate it. We would like to improve it, right? So as that pain point is being described, the analyst would be documenting out-of-the-box capabilities of SharePoint. Yeah, there's document management capabilities, workflow we can use, auditing, operational. We have challenges around departmental orders, accident report reviews. HR, we have challenges around onboarding. So as they're describing all their business pain points, right, the analyst is not blurting out, well, you can use SharePoint, this, that, the other. The analyst is documenting all this, but at the same time, mapping it to what SharePoint can do and cannot do, right? Or what SharePoint can do out of the box, I should say. And then another point to this, as the analyst is working with the business, the analyst would ask them, okay, operations, you have all these pain points, SOP creation, departmental orders, accident report reviews. If there's a problem, if there's a pain point we can address right now, what would that be? How would you rank all these? So the analyst would facilitate that exercise with the business to rank what could be solved first. Because at the end of the day, you can't do them all at the same time. So once that's done, the analyst can flip the view now, because what you want to get to here is really understanding what the pain points are, and second, realistically, what can be done right now. So this is a picture where we see all the different departments, but now on column B, we're looking at, okay, based on all the needs HR has, these are the features that we can use out of the box in SharePoint. And based on these features, let's start measuring these things. What are the priority, right? What's the priority? And this priority pretty much came from the business. A 5 for rolling out lists, and lists typically would always be a 5. A 5 would be high priority. What lists are, this allows you pretty much to create form-like capabilities, information capture capabilities. So that's why lists will always have high priority, because it's going to help them build a lot of different things. Now, next, what else do we measure? We measure what's the size and effort of rolling out lists. Now, what's that too, right? So these numbers mean something. At the bottom here, we have some standardization level of estimate. 1 means 20 hours, 2 means 3-person weeks, and this is based on a standard SharePoint skill set. So this is assuming my team does it, and that's the effort. What's the impact? The business impact is high, is number 3. How reusable is this, right? If we create these lists for HR, is it reusable for HR? Is it reusable for the whole company? Now, what's the total value? Now, there's a measurement around this. So it's literally taking the priority, adding the impact, adding the reusability minus size and effort. That's the total business value. So why are we doing this? Well, by doing this, you can now show this back to the business, because you always get that order, right? You always get that boss saying, I want you to roll out SharePoint to the whole company for 3 months, within 3 months for 1,000 people. Well, if you do this homework and show this back to the business and say, well, boss, this is what SharePoint means for the company, right? The problem is a lot of organizations out there, they don't go through this exercise working with the business, measuring which feature set to roll out first, second, or third, and that's why people get in trouble. But if you show this back to your boss, to the customer, to the decision-making, saying, look, I did my homework, I talked to the business, I figured out what the pain points are, this is what it looked like, right? So these are some of the valuable features that we can use. But if you're just telling me I'm going to do it by myself within 3 months for 1,000 people, obviously I cannot do all these things. Now, Mikko, I see your comment. Yes, I'll give you a download link for this as well. Just don't sell it. No, just kidding. But there's the other picture you want to see. So what we're measuring here is the value of these features for the business. But then we want to be realistic and really see, how can IT handle it, right? So what's the impact to IT when they implement certain features? 1 means, well, it's 20 hours. What's the support impact? What's the training impact? What's the IT total impact? Because now you have to justify, yeah, HR, this feature is very important. Having an automated onboarding process, that's a 9. But if it's a 3 for IT impact, which might mean another resource for IT, right? We don't have the budget in IT. So that's the kind of negotiation you can do, and HR says, well, that's very important. Tell you what, we'll help fund this project so we'll get that capability in place, right? So now you're doing a reality check of what's important for the business, but how much IT can do and cannot do. And this opens up to a great conversation with the business, and your job as the implementer is really to facilitate this conversation and, along with the business, prioritize what you're going to do and not going to do. Hence, you see these color codes, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and this whole thing was like a 15-month project in 3 different phases. I went through this example because this is the kind of resource you need, and this is the kind of analysis that has to happen. Unfortunately, no offense meant, not every technologist right? Not every technologist can go through this exercise with the business. And if you were to pick a resource, right now and you want to be successful with SharePoint, you need this SharePoint business analyst. So never ever underestimate the human resource requirement for a successful SharePoint environment. Okay, so just by having technical people, they're important. You got to put the technology in place, but past that, to help engage the business, define business solutions, you need your business analyst. Okay, the fifth sin is failed executive education and engagement. I kind of alluded to this early on. The common theme among IT departments that we found is that SharePoint doesn't get enough executive attention and support. Executives want the benefits but fail to make the investments that are necessary. And this boils down to lack of awareness and lack of understanding. Even though this is a 10-year-old product, it's amazing to see with a lot of decision makers I talk to is the impression of SharePoint is still very, very, how should I say this, shallow, right? So a lot of high-level decision makers, I'm not saying all, but just a lot, it's just that lack of awareness, view SharePoint as another line item in IT's technology spend. You got SQL Server, you've got Exchange Server, here's SharePoint Server, right? Unfortunately, this is not the case. As we all know, SharePoint is a business platform. It's a tool, but if implemented right, it can be leveraged across the organization and solve a lot of business needs and empowers the business to help themselves as well. So what's the challenge? What's the problem? So there's a lack of understanding, lack of awareness. Our job as implementers is really educate them from a perspective of how SharePoint can deliver value to their organization. I mean, don't present SharePoint in a technical and marketing way. You start showing all the promotional slides. Here are the 6 pillars. Here, I mean, it's helpful, but it's not going to be as powerful. So how do you define value? How do you quantify the benefit of SharePoint to the organization that executives will get? So here's an example, right? A few years ago, it was about January, I think, I got a call from a CIO of a law firm. And he said, hey, Dux, I saw you speaking at an executive workshop, and you were talking about how SharePoint could be useful in organizations, how it can save you money, all that good stuff. So here's my situation. We're a law firm. Economy's not doing well. IT's budget has been cut 30% for this fiscal year. And unfortunately, even though our budget is cut, we still have to deliver the same set of services and value to the business. So show me and prove to me that SharePoint can help me with this. That's the kind of conversation you want to get into. And I know it's not the most comfortable conversation that that technologists want to engage in, but that's the kind of a conversation you want to get into because that proves the value of SharePoint. So what happened? So I did a quick homework. I said, yeah, sure, I'd be happy to help. So here's what we're going to do. First off, let me ask you a couple questions. So we'll see, and I'll prove to you that SharePoint can help you. So you're a law firm. I see that you have about 500 people across U.S. and Europe. I suspect you guys do a lot of meetings. He goes, yep. So I suspect when you guys do meetings, since you use Microsoft tools, you guys use Microsoft Outlook, you send a meeting invite, and since you're a law firm, I bet documentation's heavy, so you would attach these documents and meeting invites and send it out. And once the meeting is done, you'd see emails fly back and forth like there's no tomorrow with all these attachments. Yes? He goes, yep, day in the life. So I go, okay, do a little homework for me. Can you go ahead and do a sample and see on the average how big people's email inboxes are? He goes, yeah, sure. So he came back to me and said, yeah, across 500 people, it's about 1.5 gig per person, average email inbox size. Okay, so what's the cost of not only keeping that up, but what's the cost of backing it up, taking care of it, and retrieving it if needed? And when I say cost, I'm not talking about just storage costs of those emails. I'm talking about the resource to take care of it, to back it up. If you get audited by Ernst & Young, for example, What's the cost of retrieving all that? So he came up with a number. I go, okay, so let's do this. What we're going to do, we're going to take that, and I'm going to prove to you that you can take 30% of that cost once you have SharePoint in place, or even more. He goes, okay. So what are we going to do? He says, I'm going to help you solve one simple problem. We're going to change how people do meetings here, and we're going to use SharePoint. And in fact, we're going to use the foundational SharePoint technology. At that time, it's called Windows SharePoint Services. It comes with Windows. They didn't even have to buy anything extra. So what we're going to do is, instead of people sending out these invites with attachments, we're going to use an out-of-the-box capability in SharePoint called Meeting Workspaces. So literally, it's a website for meetings. And the idea is, and it's built into Outlook, the idea is when anybody wants to initiate a meeting, instead of sending files that are attached, a meeting workspace will be created from Outlook, and all the artifacts, all the communications, all the agenda would be in this meeting workspace. And the value is people won't be emailing files back and forth. Number two is they can find things easily. And number three, only people that are part of that meeting would be allowed to access all these artifacts. So that whole engagement took about 3 months, putting SharePoint in place, training people. On the 5th and 6th month, we kind of met, and we want to measure how powerful this is. So number one, when it was rolled out, people's email inboxes were reduced to 500 megs. So that means they weren't, backing up as much email stuff. And number two, we found that after people were trained, they got used to it, they actually liked it, because now they can go to their meeting site, they can find stuff easier without digging through emails. And number three, one thing we didn't account for, which actually happened, he said, Dux, one of the things we had before is we had 3 T1 lines coming into corporate. And the reason why we had that much dedicated connectivity is people here send emails a lot with attached files to a lot of people. So imagine if you send 10 files to 10 people and you hit send, that's essentially sending 100 files. How much bandwidth that consumes, I don't know, depending on how big that file is. But because of what we did here, people aren't sending files anymore in massive quantities. They're all on the meeting site. Of those 3 T1 lines, we were able to drop 1. So meaning we saved money from that, right? So my point here, friends, is I spent time describing that. That's the kind of conversations you want to get into with your executives and decision makers. You want to prove, you don't have to do anything, but really talk around what you're doing in the organization. Think about what the pain points are, what the inefficiencies are. Pick a simple one. Don't go after, we're going to integrate our SAP, our CRM. We're going to integrate all that with SharePoint. You can do it, but that's high risk. So pick a small thing, day-to-day thing, if you may, and prove to it that there's value. And once they get that, then you talk about the next thing. Then you talk about the next solution you want to roll out. And that's why a platform like SharePoint, if you're in a 5-year SharePoint project, something is wrong. With a platform like SharePoint, the idea here is very iterative. You're constantly rolling out solutions for different groups in the business. Hence the spreadsheet I showed you earlier. That's valuable because now once you identify the pain points, you can start defining the roadmap of how your implementation would look like. And again, once you go SharePoint, your job is to constantly look for business solutions you can build, processes you can automate, and if there's any other tools you can get rid of or that makes sense and just maximize the platform, the better. And that's where the value comes in. When executives understand the return portion of the equation, it's much easier to get them to commit to the investment side. And so what we found, again, around executive education engagement, having them aware about what the platform would mean for their organization, and it might not be the big picture right away, but little things that they see value. So things like building dashboards, things like being able to measure how projects are doing, those are very critical. Measuring resources, right? So again, educate your executives about the platform and what the value it brings to the organization. So gang, hopefully those 5 deadly sins kind of enlightened you. I saw a bunch of questions. So are there any questions? And before I hit questions here, there's my contact info. Feel free to connect with me, and there's more information about my organization. Check that out. So let's see. I've got a couple of questions here. Yasmina, what's the best way do you want me to scroll through the chat room or just look at Q&A?
Oh, however you want. Can you see them in Q&A or in the group chat? However you see them.
Yeah, in the Q&A, I see only one.
Okay, okay. We'll double check to see if there's any additional ones, but we want to let you folks know, please do send your questions in. Type them into the group chat while we do have Dux with us so he can answer your questions. Back to you, Dux.
Sorry. Oh, you're welcome. Thank you. So, Mark, did I see a Mac Safari, any little limitations, SB 2010? That's the beauty of SharePoint 2010. Personally, I feel like it's the most open source Microsoft product out there. SharePoint 2010 works pretty much any platform, Safari, IE. The only limitation is very minor. So there's a feature called the datasheet view. It's IE specific, but it's not a showstopper. But most of everything you need to do, you could do it on a Mac. In fact, even on your mobile devices, be it Android or iPhone. Okay, Jeff, to the point of third-party applications, are governance and management applications worth looking at within an environment that has a hard time with the idea of governance? Jeff, actually, I say yes, and here's why. So I'm just going to talk about from my own experience. So we've actually helped a lot of organizations use tools like AvePoint. AvePoint is a great governance automation tool. The more you can automate governance, that's the more you can, how do I say it? The less your users would have to do certain things, the better. And the way you could do that is you can automate a lot of these governance-related activities. So, for example, like permission management. We know if you don't handle your permission management well, it could be a big problem in SharePoint. Out-of-the-box SharePoint, there's no elegant way of managing permissions. But there's a lot of tools there that you can restrict and automate and manage permissions much better than out-of-the-box SharePoint, for example, which means it's going to be less work for your users. So if you have the opportunity, and I suggest if you're a large enterprise, highly suggest you invest on tools if you can automate governance. That way it's going to be less, quote-unquote, less work for the actual users. But second, it's going to be less human intervention as well. Okay? So hopefully that answered. To me, it's worth it. Let's see. So I'm going to look at the chat room here. Randy, majority of execs don't get engaged in this. Why is that? Do they not see the value SharePoint benefit? Randy, that's a great question. I don't think it's not they don't see the value. I think that executives just aren't aware of the value. And so here's why, right? Executives won't have the time of day to read a technical book on SharePoint. Executives won't have the time of day to attend a 4-day conference. I think it's our job, and right now primarily I think IT, as IT puts a platform in place, or as IT is told to put the platform in place, if you can, before you do that, you have to spend time, ask an hour from your decision maker to say, this is what SharePoint means and this is what the investment looked like. Just like that spreadsheet I showed you earlier, that's very powerful to show them, even before you start doing any of the technical stuff, right? So it's that kind of conversation that you need to get into. Sending them an article about SharePoint, here are the benefits, consolidate your infrastructure. I mean, that's all good, but to me that's all kumbaya. Unless you show them the dollars and the cents, what it means to their organization, that's the only time that we'll truly, truly get it, right? And you say majority of execs don't engage in this. Absolutely. It's our job to engage with them and make sure they get it. They won't take the initiative to do it upon themselves. It is tough. It's not easy. Yep. Let's see. How much do you charge per day, and how many days would you recommend to help set up Share for project management metrics? Emily, great question. It depends. Personally, for my practice, so I do a lot of different things for my company. I charge differently if I cook for you versus not. I enjoy cooking, or I do BA work. So just reach out to me. Let me, tell me what exactly you're thinking about. I'd be more than happy to answer your question. But it depends. When you say SharePoint for project management metrics, are you thinking about portfolio management, resource management, looking at SharePoint-related tools? So it depends. So just drop me an email. Randy, am I sharing the worksheet? Absolutely. So gang, just drop me a line, or I'll work with Yasmina and O'Reilly, and everything I showed you, the worksheet, I'll send you a governance template, I'll send you a lot of other stuff that I was talking about. But definitely, just again, all I ask is don't sell it, and it might sound funny, but I've actually seen somebody sold my stuff online, so it's not good. Tina, how do you sell SharePoint 2010 if your enterprise Google Apps crazy? Maybe not the right combo. Yeah, no, that's good. So here's a quick answer, Tina. The problem is when we think about the enterprise, you got Google Apps, you got all these tools. Now, don't get me wrong, they're fine. But the problem is, so let's take Google Apps, right? So let's say you use Google Apps. You use Google Apps for a specific purpose. You enter the data there. The problem with Google Apps, that data in Google Apps, if you need to bring it back to the enterprise, let's say you need to put it back in your Excel spreadsheet or project or your SQL server in the enterprise, somebody has to manually type it in again. Again, that's just a simple example. The beauty with SharePoint is, with SharePoint as a platform, I can put my stuff on SharePoint, and I can make it show up in Excel. I can make it show up in project. In fact, I don't even have to go to SharePoint. I could go to Outlook and put stuff in Outlook, and it will show up in my phone because SharePoint let me do that, right? So if you think about SharePoint, SharePoint can be the glue, the platform, the keychain that holds everything together, right? Drop me a line. I can give you a lot of use cases and videos that I've done in the past that makes a great case. In the end of the day, corporate America or corporate North America is using Microsoft tools. I'm not saying it's perfect, but at the end of the day, everybody in their enterprise has Windows, has Office, and that's where the power comes in. SharePoint is the glue that could tie all these pieces together with the back end of the enterprise. Google Apps cannot do that. Now, don't get me wrong. If you're not a Microsoft shop, if you're using a Mac, you're a small company, and you're using Google Apps, yeah, that might work. But you can't make an Excel file expose the data back up to SharePoint, which will expose to a web service, with Google Apps alone and without programming. With SharePoint, you could do all that stuff out of the box. Okay. Yeah, Annette. I'll work with Yasmina. I have stuff. I'll figure out how to send everything to everyone. But I'm just respectful of everyone's time here. I could take 2 or 3 more questions. We got a minute and a half or 2. Okay, discount. Catherine, somebody's asking about discount. Yeah, hopefully. I mean, how'd you guys find this session? Is this helpful? Again, SharePoint is a wonderful platform, but just like anything else, it's a tool, right? The enterprise can benefit from it if you just take these 5 cents that I've talked about, be intentional about it, think about where you're at in that implementation continuum. And if there's anything you need, anything I can help you with, there's my contact info. Thanks for joining me this session. And Yasmina, thank you for providing this platform. Hopefully this was beneficial to everyone.